Cuba like you've never seen before. 21 bizarre, surprising, and even shocking facts that will blow your mind. These are not the cliches you've heard 1,000 times, but raw truths and hidden gems no one talks about. Stay with me until the end, and don't forget to subscribe. 1. The Guantánamo Bay is not only an American base, but also a unique marine ecosystem. When people hear Guantánamo Bay, most immediately think of the controversial U.S. naval base and prison. But few realize that the bay itself is a natural wonder, home to one of Cuba's most diverse marine ecosystems. Its warm, shallow waters host mangrove forests, seagrass beds, and coral reefs that shelter hundreds of fish, turtles, and even manatees. Scientists have long argued that the ecological importance of this area rivals that of Cuba's famous national parks. Ironically, the political disputes surrounding the base have made the bay one of the least studied marine regions in the Caribbean because access is heavily restricted. This combination of geopolitics and untouched nature makes Guantánamo Bay both a symbol of conflict and a hidden paradise for biodiversity. 2. In Cuba, more than 70% of the population lives in their own home because the state distributed housing. One of the most unusual features of Cuban society is the extremely high rate of home ownership. After the revolution, the government carried out a massive redistribution program where private landlords were eliminated and properties were handed over to the families who lived in them. This means that today more than 70% of Cubans legally own their homes, a figure far higher than in most Western countries. But here's the twist. Although people own their homes, selling, renovating, or even expanding them has historically been tightly controlled by the state. For decades, housing was considered more of a social right than a market asset. As a result, many Cuban families live in charming but crumbling colonial buildings or Soviet-style apartment blocks that haven't seen major repairs in decades. Still, for many locals, the pride of saying, "This is my house," carries deep symbolic value. 3. In Cuba, two official currencies operated in parallel, the peso nacional and the convertible peso until recently. For many years, Cuba lived under one of the strangest financial experiments in the world, a dual currency system. On one side, there was the Cuban peso, mainly used by locals to pay salaries and buy essentials, and on the other side, the convertible peso, known as CUC, which was pegged to the US dollar and used mostly in tourism, luxury shops, and for imported goods. This created a bizarre economy where a Cuban doctor might earn the equivalent of $30 a month in pesos, but a tourist would pay the same $30 for a single dinner in Havana. The gap between the two currencies created deep inequality, as those who had access to CUCs, usually through tourism or remittances, could afford far more than those living only on pesos. In 2021, the government finally unified the currencies, but the scars of that economic imbalance remain fresh in Cuban society. 4. In the suburbs of Havana operates the world's largest functioning cigar factory. When people think of Cuba, cigars almost always come to mind, and for good reason. Just outside Havana lies the massive El Laguito factory, often described as the largest functioning cigar factory in the entire world. It is famous as the birthplace of the iconic Cohiba brand, originally rolled exclusively for Fidel Castro and top government officials before being released to the public in the 1980s. Inside the factory, hundreds of skilled torcedores, or cigar rollers, work entirely by hand, using traditional techniques passed down for generations. The building itself was once a grand mansion, later transformed into this cigar-making powerhouse. What makes it especially unique is the tradition of a lector, a reader who entertains the workers by reading literature, newspapers, or even political texts aloud while they roll cigars. This blend of craft, culture, and ritual has made Cuban cigars a global symbol of luxury. 5. In Cuba, press is forbidden to openly criticize the government. Unlike in many other countries where the press acts as a watchdog over politicians, in Cuba, journalism has long been controlled by the state. Newspapers, radio stations, and TV channels are all owned and managed by the government, and their role is mainly to support the official line rather than question it. Independent or opposition media has been banned for decades, and those who attempt to publish critical stories risk censorship, harassment, or even imprisonment. Instead of investigative journalism, Cuban media often highlights achievements in healthcare, education, and sports, painting a consistently positive image of the system. That being said, in recent years, digital media has slowly opened small cracks as independent bloggers and social media users find creative ways to share their perspectives online. Still, the reality is that in Cuba, freedom of the press remains one of the most restricted in the Western Hemisphere. 6. In rural Cuba, many places still lack full sewage systems. While Havana and larger cities have basic infrastructure, much of rural Cuba still faces serious sanitation challenges. In small towns and villages, families often rely on septic tanks, pit latrines, or even improvised drainage systems because there is no centralized sewage network. This situation stems partly from decades of underinvestment and the U.S. embargo, which made it difficult to import pipes, pumps, and treatment equipment. The result is that during heavy rains, flooding can contaminate drinking water and spread disease, making hygiene a constant concern. Yet Cubans are famously resourceful. Many households create clever homemade solutions, from simple filtration systems to shared community wells. For travelers, this hidden side of Cuba shows a stark contrast. The same country that offers world-class doctors and free healthcare still struggles with basic sanitation in rural areas. It's one of those contradictions that make Cuba such a fascinating, complex place. 7. Cuba was the first Caribbean country to completely eliminate illiteracy. In 1961, just 2 years after the revolution, Cuba launched one of the most ambitious education campaigns the world had ever seen. Thousands of young volunteers, many of them teenagers, were sent from cities into rural villages to teach farmers and laborers how to read and write. They lived with the families, worked alongside them in the fields during the day, and taught literacy lessons at night. By the end of that year, over 700,000 Cubans had learned to read, and the government declared illiteracy officially eradicated. This campaign became a cornerstone of Cuban pride, showing the world that even a poor nation could prioritize education for all. Today, Cuba boasts one of the highest literacy rates globally, at nearly 100%. It remains one of the few socialist experiments that undeniably succeeded, and many countries later studied and copied Cuba's literacy model. 8. Cuba was one of the world's largest sugar exporters in the 20th century. For much of the last century, sugar was the lifeblood of Cuba's economy. Vast plantations stretched across the island, and entire towns revolved around sugar mills that never seemed to stop. At its peak, Cuba was exporting millions of tons of sugar each year, mostly to the Soviet Union, which guaranteed steady prices and political support. This made Cuba incredibly dependent on one single product, so much so that when the USSR collapsed in the early 1990s, the Cuban economy nearly crumbled overnight. The so-called special period brought severe shortages of food, fuel, and basic goods, showing just how dangerous it was to rely so heavily on sugar. Even though production has dropped dramatically since then, the legacy of sugar is still everywhere, in rum, in traditional desserts, and in the countless ghostly ruins of old mills scattered across the countryside. Sugar literally built modern Cuba, both its prosperity and its hardships. 9. The Cuban government banned the celebration of Christmas in the 1960s, only bringing it back in the 1990s. This might sound unbelievable, but for over 3 decades, Christmas was not an official holiday in Cuba. After the revolution, the government declared the island an atheist state and considered religious festivities unnecessary, even counterproductive to socialist ideals. From 1969 onward, December 25th was just another workday, and families had to celebrate quietly at home if they chose to. Public nativity scenes, Christmas trees, and church events were rare, and many children grew up without knowing the holiday's traditions. It wasn't until 1997, just before a visit from Pope John Paul II, that Christmas was officially restored as a public holiday. Since then, Cubans have slowly revived the festive spirit, but the celebration often feels simpler than in other countries, with fewer decorations and more focus on family meals. The decades-long ban remains one of the most striking examples of how politics reshaped everyday life on the island. 10. Among Cubans, a popular drink is Guarapo, made from sugarcane juice. If you stroll through a Cuban market on a hot afternoon, chances are you'll hear the grinding sound of sugarcane being crushed to make guarapo. This refreshing drink is simply the raw juice of the cane, served cold, sometimes with a splash of lime. It's naturally sweet, energizing, and for many locals, it's a nostalgic taste of childhood. Guarapo has been enjoyed in Cuba for centuries, long before soft drinks arrived, and it's still considered one of the most authentic Cuban refreshments. What makes it special is the ritual. Vendors often press the cane right in front of you with old, squeaky machines, handing over a glass of foamy green gold liquid that tastes unlike anything bottled. For tourists, it's a cheap and delicious way to cool down, often costing less than $1. In a country built on sugar, Guarapo remains the purest, simplest expression of Cuba's sweet heritage. 11. Cuba is home to the largest salt mine in the Caribbean. Hidden away from the tourist beaches, Cuba has a massive salt production industry that many visitors never hear about. The largest salt mine in the entire Caribbean is located in Guantánamo province, where huge evaporation ponds shimmer under the tropical sun. Here, seawater is carefully channeled into shallow basins, and over weeks of intense heat, the water evaporates, leaving behind thick, sparkling layers of pure sea salt. This salt isn't just for Cuban kitchens. Much of it is exported abroad, providing an important source of income for the island. The sight of endless pinkish salt flats, dotted with white mounds, is breathtaking, almost resembling a frozen landscape in the middle of the tropics. Local workers, many of whom have been in the trade for generations, take pride in this unique industry. It's a reminder that Cuba's natural wealth goes beyond cigars and rum. Even its salt has global importance. 12. The Mojito and the Daiquiri cocktails both originated in Cuba. When it comes to cocktails, few countries can claim as much fame as Cuba. The Mojito, with its refreshing mix of rum, lime, mint, sugar, and soda water, was born in Havana and quickly spread around the world as a summer favorite. Meanwhile, the daiquiri, a simple yet elegant blend of rum, lime juice, and sugar, takes its name from a small village near Santiago de Cuba, where American engineers first mixed it in the early 1900s. Both drinks were immortalized by Ernest Hemingway, who famously enjoyed them at La Bodeguita del Medio and El Floridita bars in Havana. These cocktails are more than just beverages. They are pieces of Cuban culture, tied to the island's sugarcane, its rum industry, and its lively social life. To sip them in Havana today, surrounded by live music and colonial charm, feels like tasting history in a glass. 13. There are no McDonald's restaurants in Cuba, except for one located at the Guantánamo Bay base. In a world where the golden arches seem to pop up on every corner, Cuba is one of the very few countries where McDonald's has never taken root. The U.S. trade embargo and Cuba's socialist economy have kept global fast food chains out of reach, so Big Macs and McFlurries are absent from Havana's streets. The only exception is a single McDonald's tucked inside the U.S. naval base at Guantánamo Bay, a place that ordinary Cubans cannot access. Instead, locals have their own versions of quick eats, like peso pizzas, sold from small windows, or hearty street snacks, such as ham sandwiches and fritters. For many travelers, the absence of McDonald's rolls and other global brands makes Cuba feel like stepping into a time capsule, where foreign influence is limited and local food culture dominates. It's one of those quirky details that highlight just how different Cuba really is. 14. In Cuban schools, children are required to study music. Education in Cuba isn't just about math and science. The arts are considered just as essential. From a young age, every child is exposed to music, whether through singing, playing simple percussion instruments, or learning traditional Cuban rhythms. This is partly why the island has produced such an extraordinary number of world-class musicians, despite its small size. Schools often organize choirs, bands, and dance groups, making music a daily part of student life rather than an optional activity. For some, this early exposure becomes the first step toward careers in salsa, son cubano, or classical performance. Even those who don't pursue music professionally carry that deep sense of rhythm and cultural pride throughout their lives. Walk through any Cuban neighborhood and you'll hear children drumming on improvised instruments or singing in groups, proof that music isn't just entertainment in Cuba, it's part of their education and identity. 15. Cuba is the only Caribbean country that supplies its population with its own pharmaceutical developments. While most Caribbean nations rely heavily on imported medicines, Cuba has built a surprisingly advanced pharmaceutical and biotechnology industry. Decades of isolation pushed the country to innovate, and Cuban scientists developed treatments and vaccines that gained international recognition. For example, Cuba created its own lung cancer vaccine, a unique diabetic foot ulcer treatment, and even produced several COVID-19 vaccines during the pandemic. These breakthroughs are not just for export. The government ensures that Cuban citizens have free access to them as part of the country's universal healthcare system. This self-sufficiency is remarkable for a small, resource-limited island under embargo. It shows how necessity can spark creativity, turning Cuba into a global leader in medical innovation. For many visitors, it's astonishing to realize that in the Caribbean, one of the poorest nations also stands at the cutting edge of medical science. 16. Cuban radio stations often broadcast literary readings. In Cuba, radio has always been more than just music and news. It has been a cultural lifeline. One of the most charming traditions is the broadcasting of literature. Novels, short stories, and poetry are read aloud on national and local stations. For decades, this was one of the main ways ordinary Cubans, especially in rural areas without access to many books, could experience classic works of literature. Entire generations grew up listening to radio dramas and serialized readings, much like old-fashioned audiobooks. Even today, while the internet slowly spreads, these literary broadcasts remain popular, combining art with accessibility. It reflects Cuba's emphasis on education and culture as tools for social equality. Imagine tuning in to the radio and instead of advertisements or pop hits, you hear a skilled voice actor bringing Gabriel Garcia Marquez or Jose Marti to life. That's a uniquely Cuban experience. 17. Cuba is one of the largest tobacco exporters in the world. When you think of premium cigars, chances are the word Cuba instantly comes to mind. The island's climate, soil, and centuries-old traditions make it one of the best places on Earth to grow tobacco. The Pinar del Rio region, often called the tobacco capital of the world, produces the finest leaves used in legendary brands like Cohiba, Montecristo, and Partagas. What sets Cuban tobacco apart is not only the quality, but also the craftsmanship. Cigars are hand-rolled by skilled torcedores, many of whom come from families that have passed down the art for generations. Cuba exports hundreds of millions of cigars each year, bringing in billions of dollars in revenue, despite trade restrictions with countries like the United States. For many smokers and collectors, a Cuban cigar is not just tobacco. It's a symbol of luxury, tradition, and cultural pride that has no rival anywhere else. 18. In Cuba, one of the most popular forms of transportation is the cycle rickshaw, known as the bicitaxi. If you wander through Havana's busy streets or smaller provincial towns, you'll quickly notice colorful three-wheeled bicycles carrying passengers. These are bicitaxis, a cheap and eco-friendly way to get around, especially for short distances. They became widespread during the special period in the 1990s when fuel shortages forced Cubans to find alternatives to cars and buses. Drivers often decorate their bicitaxis with bright colors, music systems, and even personal slogans, turning each ride into a unique experience. For locals, they're a daily necessity, while for tourists, they're a fun and authentic way to explore narrow streets and neighborhoods where cars rarely go. A bicitaxi ride costs only a fraction of a regular taxi, making it accessible to everyone. Beyond transportation, they symbolize Cuban resilience. When resources were scarce, people quite literally pedaled their way out of crisis, and the tradition still thrives today. 19. On Cuban state television, many Mexican soap operas are broadcast. Turn on a Cuban TV in the evening, and you might be surprised, instead of purely local programs, you'll often find Mexican telenovelas filling the primetime slots. These dramatic, long-running soap operas became wildly popular in Cuba because they provided a mix of escapism, romance, and high drama that contrasted with the more rigid, propaganda-heavy local productions. Shows from Televisa in Mexico, with their lavish sets and emotional storylines, captivated Cuban audiences for decades. Families would gather around the TV to follow the latest twists, gossiping about the characters as if they were neighbors. In a country where outside entertainment was limited due to embargoes and censorship, Mexican telenovelas became cultural staples, influencing fashion, language, and even Cuban theater. It's a quirky example of how global pop culture seeps in, even in one of the most isolated media environments in the Western Hemisphere. 20. On a Cuban child's birthday, it is common to throw cake at the celebrant. In most countries, birthday cake is meant to be eaten, but in Cuba, the tradition often takes a playful twist. After the candles are blown out, it's not unusual for family or friends to smash a piece of cake right into the birthday child's face. This custom, called empastilla, turns the celebration into a mix of laughter, surprise, and a little mess. While it might shock outsiders, for Cubans, it's a sign of affection and joy. The idea is that birthdays should be fun and unforgettable. Children wait for it with both excitement and dread, knowing they'll end up covered in frosting. Parents usually buy big, colorful cakes specifically for this tradition, and sometimes even stage playful cake battles where more than one person gets smeared. It's one of those quirky Cuban customs that shows how humor and family bonding are baked into their everyday celebrations. 21. In the late 1950s, the Cuban government banned the Monopoly board game. It might sound almost comical, but in revolutionary Cuba, even a board game was seen as a threat. Monopoly, with its emphasis on private property, rent collection, and ruthless competition, clashed head-on with the socialist ideals of equality and community. By the end of the 1950s, the game was officially prohibited, and imported sets were confiscated. The idea was simple. Teaching children to get rich by bankrupting their neighbors was not exactly the lesson the new government wanted to promote. Ironically, the ban turned Monopoly into something of a forbidden treasure, with families secretly holding on to old sets and playing in private. Today, it's still very hard to find in Cuba, though some homemade versions exist, often adapted with Cuban street names and landmarks. This quirky ban shows just how deeply politics shaped even the smallest details of everyday Cuban life. That was our journey through 21 shocking and rarely told facts about Cuba, a country that is far more complex than cigars, rum, and beaches. If you enjoyed discovering these hidden sides of Cuba, make sure to subscribe and support the channel so I can bring you even more unique stories from around the world. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next adventure with Andy Explores the World.